Turn to Exodus 18, okay? And as we get started, I just want to remind you why we do this, why we come to church. I already said a little bit about this, but it's an opportunity for us to slow down, hit the pause button, make life stop a little bit, and think about what matters, right? What's meaningful, what your purpose is, and who your God is. And that's the same reason we preach these messages from up here, is to communicate to you truth from God, to help you understand Him, help you understand your life. And so I want to ask you as we get started this morning to think about this, and maybe we'll interact a little bit. How many of you would say that you think a lot about the meaning of your life, the purpose of your life, recognizing that some of you may a lot, some of you may not so much, some of you maybe just caught up in the busyness and the frantic pace of things don't. But how many of you would say you think about it a lot, what the meaning of your life is, the purpose of your life is, okay, and how your particular station in life or your vocation or whatever fits within that. So a good number of you. How many of you say you don't think about it a whole lot? I mean, you're kind of busy with the tasks. Okay, a couple of you would just say, hey, just busy with what's right in front of you. Whether you're on the side that you think about it a lot or you don't think about it quite as much, either way, you all think about it some. I think about it. I'm probably on the side of thinking about it too much. Think about it a lot. Some to do with the way I'm wired. And one of the things that we're learning together is that one level of the meaningfulness of our lives or the purpose of our lives comes from how we understand what we're doing, what we're up to, what our responsibilities are, what our relationships are in this world, kind of our position and our activity. Another level of that, which we try to highlight for you every week, is who God is, what He's up to in your life, what He's teaching you, what He's doing in you, what He's doing through you, what He's doing around you. And one of the things that we say often, and we say it a lot of different ways, but one of the things that we say often is that in actuality, more important than the details we tend to get caught up in our daily lives, more important than the level of our position, our activities, is the higher level of who God is and what He's up to. That's what really enriches our lives, gives our lives meaning. And this morning, it's interesting, in Exodus 18 here, we have a conversation between two guys, Moses and his father-in-law Jethro, in which they're talking about meaning. They're talking about what Moses has experienced with the Israelites in terms of what God has done. And it's a testimony of deliverance. And as I think about my life and I think about your lives and the individual, unique nature of your lives, it's actually helpful for us to consider, as I said earlier, who God is and what He's up to, and to know that really the purpose of your life in a very real sense is that you would have a testimony concerning God's deliverance in your life. That's what it means to know Him through Jesus, our Savior. You relate to God as a saved person to a Savior, as a delivered person to a deliverer. And so the testimony of your life at that highest level is really about God's deliverance in your life. And whether we find ourselves thinking about that a lot or just a little bit, that is the truth. That's really the foundation beneath our lives. It's the overarching sort of umbrella over our lives is the person and work of Christ and what God is doing and how God has woven our life into the tapestry of His story, human history. And we're going to see these two men stopping and thinking about God's deliverance here in Exodus 18. Let me read verses 1 through 12, and as usual, walk through it, make some observations, and we'll receive some encouragement by it. Okay? So Exodus 18, verses 1 through 12, says, Now Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Moses' wife Zipporah after he had sent her away, and her 2 sons, of whom one was named Gershom. For Moses said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. The other was named Eliezer, for he said, the God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was camped at the mount of God. He sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Then Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law all the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had befallen them on the journey, and how the Lord had delivered them. Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, delivering them from the hand of the Egyptians. So Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. Indeed, it was proven when they dealt proudly against the people. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. First of all, I want you to notice this in verse 1. It says Jethro heard of all that God had done for Moses. I want you to recognize that this means the testimony of God's deliverance, rescuing his people from the Egyptians, that testimony had spread rapidly. And you can imagine, in those days, communication is a little more challenging than today, a lot more challenging than today. And yet, by word of mouth, probably family members passing it along, merchants maybe traveling, heard of what had happened, and word got around to the point where Jethro in Midian hears about this deliverance of God. This is God staying true to his word when he said earlier in Exodus, look, I'm going to do this to proclaim my name, that my reputation might be spread. And really that's his purpose in our day as well. He is spreading his reputation as a delivering God, as a gracious God. The book of Romans talks about what God was doing behind the scenes and how God hardened Pharaoh's heart and how he set everything up. He set the game board up in order to cause this deliverance to take place. It was all part of his plan by design. And he says, I'm doing it for my name's sake, to spread my glory, to spread my reputation. That's what his purpose was, and lo and behold, it's happening. This is being fulfilled. His reputation is spreading around, such that Jethro, far away in Midian, even hears word of what had happened and what God had done for his people, the Israelites. So, first I want us to kind of think about how the word was spreading. God is fulfilling his promises as usual, and then look at, and we're going to sort of zoom in on this, how Moses mentions, or it's recorded here, the names of Moses' sons. And in those days, they gave probably more thought to the names of their children than we tend to today. Our daughters, man, we just pick the names because we like them. And then our names start with J. Juliana, we went with a J, and wow, now we got to keep consistent, so we just went with J all the way through. But didn't think about what their names mean, although they have meaning. It's interesting to look up the meaning of your kids' names, but you probably didn't think about it much. Well, in those days, that was really significant for them. They gave a great deal of thought to it. And Moses' first son's name was Gershom, and it kind of speaks to Moses, kind of, I think, maybe reading between the lines here, but I think his pessimistic perspective, because the name Gershom means a sojourner in a foreign land. It means a guy who's displaced. And you remember, he grew up in Egypt in the lap of luxury, and then he had to flee because Pharaoh wanted to kill him, and so he fled to Midian, this place that was foreign to him, and he became a nobody for a long, long time before ever God called him into this ministry he has. He just, for years and years and years, decades really, was just a nobody. And he viewed himself as this sojourner, a man without a home, in a sense. And I do think that there was a little negativity to that. Poor Gershom, right? Firstborn, he gets stuck with this name. But that's how he was viewing his life, kind of a pessimistic outlook on life. But then his second son comes along after what he experienced with the deliverance from Egypt, and his name is Eliezer. And the Hebrew words that make up the name Eliezer means, my God is help. And as I looked and sort of studied that word, essentially one commentator mentioned that the word has to do with help wherein someone does something for you that you cannot do for yourself. And Moses, as he named this son, was thinking about what God had done for him that he could never have done for himself, namely delivering him and his people from the Egyptians. And I think I've probably beat that to death, talking about how impossible it was for them, how they never would have been able to overcome the Egyptian army, how they were unarmed slaves, untrained, and they're facing probably the strongest military of the time. And God miraculously rescued them, and we've gone into great detail about that. But this name is a celebration. It has to do with Moses' testimony, that at one point he's thinking in a very sort of negative way. He's just this nobody in the middle of nowhere with no home. And yet now he has his testimony of God's deliverance in his life. God's done something. It is hard sometimes for us to see our lives through the lenses of God's goodness, isn't it? I mean, in this room, there are a number of people who would be more on the pessimistic side of the spectrum, and others who would be more on the optimistic side of the spectrum, and all places in between. And depending on what's going on in your life, you might find yourself in one place or the other. But optimism and pessimism, we're all kind of going like this, and some of us, again, tend to be more on one side than the other. But it's true that we all struggle on some level to look at our life the way God looks at our life. When He looks at every detail of your life and says, it is all good, it's all by design, it's all part of my plan, it's all part of my story, it all has meaning and purpose and is meant to enrich that person. And it really is part of my plan to deliver you. All of it is. Take the most optimistic person in the room, and I could kind of guess in my mind who that might be. But take that person, right? Whoever you are, there are aspects of your life that are still frustrating to you. And it may be that with your oozing with optimism way of going through life, there are people who get in the way of that. Probably pessimistic people who get in your way, or the Debbie Downers who kind of frustrate you. Or you feel like, well, I've had to overcome. I've had to conquer the hardships of my life. And I talk to a lot of people. I know this is true. I tend to be a little more on the pessimistic side of things. Jill smiles. She's like, a little more? Yeah, like a lot more. All right. That's the way I like to say it, but I've been informed several times that it's actually pessimism. Regardless, we all have a way of looking at our lives sometimes that we could kind of name our kid Gershom. I don't know. I'm just out here. I'm stuck with all these adverse circumstances. But as Moses' life went along, and a lot of time went along, I mean, when God called him, he was 80. When he called him at the burning bush, I mean, he's lived a lot of life. At this point, he's even older, of course. And he just starts to see more and more clearly, wow, my Creator God actually has a plan. He's up to something. He's up to something good. He's a deliverer. He's a rescuer. He's a liberator. And I've benefited from that. And that is one of the things God is teaching us. I had Mikkel read Psalm 16 earlier, one of my favorite Psalms. And there's a line in that Psalm. It says this. It says, the lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me. That's the psalmist acknowledging at that point of clarity in his life, God's been good to me. The way things have played out to me have been good. And despite my pessimistic leanings, there are times in my life I really see that. And I have this lightness and this gratitude and this joy as a result of that. And there are other times I don't. And I suspect it's the same with you. Thankfully, we have a consistent God who doesn't waffle like we do, who's up to something, and He's teaching us. He's showing us more and more and more through what we go through in life. The ups, the downs, the things that are easy, the things that are hard, the successes, the failures. He's revealing things about Himself. He's helping us to see our life story the way He sees it, as good. And it may be that we may not see it that way until we're home. But at some point, we're going to see it that way. And for all eternity, we're going to look back and we're going to see it that way. And in heaven, every one of us will be, maybe we should say, Dave, every one of us will be a realist in heaven, but like an optimistic realist, which I'm looking forward to. Moses' testimony. We see it in even how he names his children. And then Jethro meets with him, okay? And it says, kind of interesting, when Jethro approaches, we had our men's meeting. I can't say too much about this to implicate us and in some of our negativity. But it's hilarious that Jethro shows up with Zipporah and the kids, and it's kind of like the grandparents bringing the kids back to their parents, saying, okay, I'm too old for this. Get your kids back. Hey, Moses, later in the chapter, he's got these great ideas about how Moses can delegate so that he doesn't have to do all the work. And it's kind of like he's saying, hey, look, let's free you up a little bit so you can take your family back. You take them back. These are your kids. We had a fun weekend, but I'm too old for this. They're all yours. So Jethro brings the wife and kids back to him. And it's funny, too, I don't know who pointed this out. It's probably Josh on Skype, but it's funny how it says Moses, he bows before Jethro, this respect. Of course, Jethro is his benefactor. Jethro is his father-in-law. Jethro is a priest, utmost respect. It says he kissed him. It never says he kisses his wife Zipporah, but he kissed Jethro. I don't know, maybe he did, but we're not told that he did. Ladies in here are just like, yeah, of course, typical husband, what a jerk. And this says they asked each other their welfare and went into the tent to talk. And you can imagine, Jethro hears about it. He wants to hear firsthand account. Hey, what happened? Tell me about it. Moses, you were there. You had kind of you had good seats. What was it like? Tell me about it. These two men just get together to sit around and talk about what had happened. About all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh, to the Egyptians, for Israel's sake. And so a couple things about what Jethro kind of learned and how Jethro was viewing God in light of what had happened. And the first thing I want us to think about a little bit is he hears of and he gains more clarity concerning the kindness of God toward his people. And I'm getting that from verse 8 where it says, they talked about all the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake. That little phrase is really significant. For Israel's sake. Now, you might know, if you've studied your Old Testament, there are many places in the Old Testament, in our English Bibles, where it says God did these things for his own name's sake. Remember earlier we said one of God's main purposes, the spreading of his name, the spreading of his reputation. And you might ask yourself the question, well, wait a minute, is this for God's sake then, or is it for his people's sake? And there's a school of thought which says, well, it's for God's sake. It's not about people. People kind of don't inherently have value, and there's some kind of hoity-toity reformed thinkers out there who kind of put it more in that context. Well, it's all for God, and we're just incidental to that, and yet that's not. When you study it out and you try to cause this to harmonize, you realize a couple things. First of all, grammatically, even though it's said the same way in English, like you look at Psalm 106 or Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, several places, God says, hey, you've profaned my name among nations, but I'm going to rescue you for my name's sake. I'm going to vindicate my name's sake. I'm going to do it for my own sake. But when you look behind the English at the Hebrew, you see there's different grammar there, different terms there. The word sake is really never used, but the picture that starts to become clear is this really, and this is interesting. See if you can track this. Hopefully I can be clear, okay? God's basically saying, because let me slow down. We could ask this way. Is God man-centered or is God God-centered? Okay, so Dave answered God-centered. So if we slow down and think really carefully, we could kind of say well, yes, kind of both. I think we could say most clearly, and this is the picture that becomes clear as you study this out, that God is man-centered because he is God-centered. God acts for man's sake because he's acting for his name's sake. Because God's character is that of a gracious and merciful and kind deliverer. As a result of that, as he acts according to his nature, he delivers people. He has mercy on people, grace for people, delivers, liberates people, rescues people. That's an outworking of his nature. And when it happens, it displays his greatness. When we think of God's glory, again, there are certain theologians who highlight this: God is big and God is powerful and God knows everything. And they talk about glory in terms of like the Shekinah glory in the Old Testament, where he shows up and it's just this overwhelming, gleaming light. And that's true. God uses those pictures to help us appreciate his greatness and his value. But in the Bible, when he speaks of the greatest display of that glory, you know where that happens? You know where that occurs? That occurs on the cross. In a kind of an unthinkable event that you wouldn't expect, where this man is dying, this innocent man is dying as a criminal, naked, alone, cursed. And God says, that's where my glory is really shown. Which helps us appreciate the fact, you know what this is about? This is about the heart of God. That's what pulls the curtains back and shows us the heart of God. And that's how we come to appreciate his value, is by seeing him as a deliverer. So when we ask the question, well, is God God-centered? Is he man-centered? Well, yes, he's man-centered because he's God-centered. And here's an ironic kind of contrast to that. When it comes to you and me, here's what our natural tendency is. Our natural tendency is to be God-centered because we're man-centered. About to do that. Our natural tendency is to be God-centered because we're man-centered. Here's what I mean by that. Particularly as religious people who care about God, who care about our Bibles, care about church participation. Our natural tendency, because of how depraved we are, is to take even the things of God and to make them about ourselves. How can I kind of co-opt God in giving me what I want in life? How can I cut a deal with God so that I can get what in the long run I want? For myself, for my family, what my view of an upstanding moral life is, or my view of a prosperous life is. There are ways that we, subtly, but ways that we seek to exalt ourselves, which is not so much about how God is delivering us from the misery of our condition, but is more about how we're seeking to deliver ourselves from the misery of our condition in the way that we deem most appropriate, or most fulfilling, or most beneficial, which is usurping, in a very real sense, the authority of our Heavenly Father, who knows better than we do what we need for deliverance. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, Rose? In Jethro's understanding of things, he is realizing, and he and Moses really both here, realizing, wow, God is acting on behalf of his people. One place, literally, it's for the cause, or for the benefit of his people. So when it says he does it, well, when God says, I'm not doing it for your sake, and it's translated that way in certain places, he doesn't mean by that I'm not doing it for your benefit. He means by that I'm not doing that on account of anything in you that would make you worthy of it. This is not a transaction where you've kind of thrown me a bone, and so now I'm going to act on your behalf. You scratched my back, so now I'll scratch your back. No, not at all. This is one-way love. This is grace being poured out on undeserving people. So that was kind of a rabbit trail, but an important one as we think about what's it mean that God is out for his glory. It doesn't mean that he's just committed to showing that he's shiny, right? Or that he's big. He wants you to see the essence of who he is, his heart, to be drawn to that heart, to be captivated by the truth of who he is, to be amazed. That's what you were created for, is to be amazed and exhilarated and excited about and to celebrate who he is. And that's sort of the doorway through which that happens in your life is the doorway of deliverance as God meets you in the mess of your condition. Over and over I've said the parallel between being enslaved to Egypt and us being enslaved to the Pharaoh of our own thinking, which is it's got to be my way, and I've got to have it this way, and just the enslavement, the misery, the beatdown that is in our lives. And God says, I care about that. And even though at root of that is how you minimize me and you try to be God and you try to sit on the throne of your life, and that just makes things miserable for you. Even though that's in a direct affront, I am going to deliver you. I'm going to rescue you. For your sake, for my name's sake. You see that? One of the things that Jethro was realizing, another thing, the last thing, is God's superiority over all the little g gods. Notice what he says in verse 11. Now I know that the Lord, let me stop, put the emphasis where it belongs. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. Jethro was a priest. He was a religious-minded man. He had understood the religion of the day, the religion of the Egyptians. He understood the religion of the Israelites. He knew who God, Yahweh, was. Connecting dots, I would imagine. Did some studying this past week, the gods of the Egyptians, and I don't think we talked about this a lot, but it's interesting, the plagues, when God caused those plagues to play out there in Egypt. Every one of those plagues was, in a way, associated with one of the gods of Egypt. So I'll give you a few examples. This is fascinating. The god of the Nile. Kind of interesting name. Happy or Hapi, Hapi. God of water and fertility. And remember, the first plague, God caused the Nile to turn to blood and everything in the Nile to die. There he's showing his superiority over that God. That God is nothing. Another god, this is another one too, the picture of this, if you look, this god, actually a goddess, Heket, the goddess of childbirth, depicted as a woman, this is attractive, with the head of a frog. Remember the frogs? Multiplication of frogs, and then God causes all of them to die, and they're piling up carcasses of dead frogs. It was a direct assault on that goddess. God showing his superiority, this goddess of childbirth, fertility goddess, Heket. And then one more here. Remember, God caused there to be darkness for 3 days? Well, the God, and you've probably heard of this one, the god of Ra, the sun god of Egypt. God showing his supremacy. I can just cause that to stop if I want to for 3 days. And then I'll just cause it to start again. Does whatever he wants. And Jethro here is reflecting on the superiority of Yahweh, the true God, over all other gods. Showing them to be nothing, showing them to be powerless, showing that they can't save. Could they save Pharaoh and the Egyptians from Yahweh? They couldn't, could they? I mean, he decimated the Egyptians. And it was not something that caused God a lot of sweat and effort. Just doing things however he wanted to, his way and his time. So, pause here. Gods of our culture, and we don't bow down before statues. You don't see many people doing that. I guess I'm sure somewhere in Olympia right now, someone's bowing down before something. Probably there's all sorts of weird stuff going on down there in downtown. But more subtle for us today. Think about our own lives. I mean, what is it that we value? That's what worship is about, attributing worth to something or someone. A number of things, man. Our own reputation. Our own family being a certain way. Our career. Could be bowing before the altar of sexual idolatry or some kind of addiction. Every negative aspect of your life, whether it's anxiety or greed or hatred of people or resentment of bitterness toward people. I mean, beneath all of that is idolatry. It's a false god of some kind that we end up worshiping, valuing. Romans 1 says that which we worship, we will serve. We become enslaved. We become in bondage to whatever it is that we value the most. So when you ask yourself, what is it about my life right now that I'm the least content with? There's a God there, little g, that you're worshiping. And when you end up in my office, or for those of you who wouldn't want to come to my office, you just keep it to yourself, but you end up miserable, you know what's going on there? God's showing his superiority over your little g God. That's what he's up to in our lives. So in the good, the obvious blessings of our lives, where we experience them and we are thankful, that is God's outpouring and we see it clearly. Or the times when we're resentful, frustrated, negative, unthankful, that would be indicative of that remaining, abiding idolatry. And God is orchestrating things, tampering with things to show you the inferiority of you, the God you've chosen for yourself. The God that I have chosen for myself. As if that could deliver. Over and over in the Bible, God says, they can't save you. And he kind of plays with the idea, you make these statues, they fall over and you got to pick them up. It's supposed to be representative of some God. How powerful is this God? It has eyes but it can't see. It has a mouth but it can't talk. Ears but it can't hear. All these finite things, and then we think, well, that's really silly, but yet we worship, again, money, our own image, how people view us, whether people respect us or not, whether people like us or not, our material things, trying to keep our world our way and kind of nice and neat and tidy and safe, that we just want. That's our value. That's where we get our security from. That's where we get our sense of identity from. God says at some point, it's coming down. I'm going to show you that it doesn't save. This is what, in his day, Jethro was learning and amazed by and celebrating. They sat there and they had this meal together, which is this picture of communion. They're communing with God and each other. It's an awesome thing. It made me think about, and I don't know how long God's going to give me to live in this world, but thinking about like later in my life, I still feel like I'm somewhat young. I like to look at myself that way. See, that's optimistic, Jill. Give me some credit here for that one, right? She's like, the word I'm thinking of is immature. That's probably what she's thinking of. Not so much young. But later, as life goes on, to sit around with a Greg or David or a Paul or a David or a Bruce or Jack, or to sit around saying, wow, God's been good to me. For them to say, yeah, God's been good to me. Here's how he's been good to me, good to my family, how his redemptive plan is. I just see it now. With all even the hard things we had to go through in life. God's been good to me. That's kind of what these guys are experiencing. And someday in heaven, that's all it's going to be. You're all, as I've said earlier, you're all different. I'm different from you. We're all unique in the way that we're created and wired and the way we experience sin and the way we experience fruitfulness. We're all different. The coming of Jesus into the world, the manifestation of God's deliverance in the greatest possible way. One of the things that it tells you and how Jesus came, we were just saying in Sunday school, we're going to be looking at the Gospels and probably spend some time in Mark where Jesus is interacting with people. And it kind of highlights how he interacts with folks. One of the things that tells us is that Jesus came for us in the uniqueness of who we are, in the uniqueness of our particular plight. So whether you're an anxious person, and that's one of the things that plagues you, he comes to you there. He meets you there in your anxiety. You're more of an angry person. You kind of feel like people are constantly getting in your way. You just want to get things done, and there's frustration that just smolders there. I mean, Jesus meets you there. You're an addicted person. You're addicted to maybe alcohol, where you got like drinking is the only way to get relief in your life, and that's kind of your escape, and you realize it's destructive, and you realize it's hurting your family. I mean, Jesus, he meets you there. Or you're addicted to the praise of people, and so you're a workaholic and you're trying to get more done so that people will praise you and respect you and all that, and Jesus meets you there. Whatever type of person you are, Jesus comes to you. Where you in particular, where you are stuck, where your depravity, your sin has poisoned you such that you experience that deep sort of plaguing emptiness or darkness or whatever it is. I mean, he meets you there as a deliverer to say, I've paid for that sin. I've covered it. I've washed it away. I've set you free from it. You're not experiencing that freedom, but you are free. God says, I meet you there. And our lives are about learning more and more how good it is that we have this delivering God, how much we need deliverance, that those aspects of our lives we can't save ourselves from. There's lots of things you can accomplish, lots of things you can overcome, lots of things you can work at, but when it comes to your sin, your blinders to your Creator, the toxic influence of those blinders, the way your lusts destroy your life, the particular unique way they destroy your life and your relationships. When it comes to those realities, those spiritual realities, He's your only hope. And the coming of Christ, the work of Christ, the message of Christ tells you He's done that on your behalf. He has rescued you. I'm going to finish with this. I haven't ordered it yet. I'm about to order a book by an author I like. His name's Nick Lannon. He wrote a book called Life is Impossible. And in the book, I was able to read the introduction to the book online last week. And as an illustration, he talks about a movie called All Is Lost. Came out in 2013. Have you ever seen the movie All Is Lost? Well, I'll tell you this right off the bat. This won't surprise you based on the title. Not the type of movie you want to be like, hey, let's make some popcorn, grab the Sour Patch Kids, get the kids together and just enjoy. It's not, obviously, it's a pretty intense movie. It's not Despicable Me 3 by any stretch of the imagination. It's about a man lost at sea. It's one actor in the movie, Robert Redford. He has like 2, maybe 3 lines in the whole movie. The whole movie is him on his sailboat. It begins this way. He's asleep in the cabin of the boat. And you hear this sound, and water just starts filling up the cabin of the boat. He wakes up, goes out to see, it's morning, he goes out to sea, and what happened was his sailboat had run into, there was a container of some kind that must have fallen off a cargo ship that was just floating there in the ocean. And his boat ran into it, and it punctured a hole in the side of his boat. Robert Redford's character in the movie is calm, goes to work, puts on his gear, goes outside, figures out how he found this kit, figures out how to patch the side of his sailboat. Then he has this pump system. He pumps out the water. But then he discovers that his electrical equipment is down, just damaged by the water. So he wants to radio for help because now his boat and the situation is compromised, but he can't radio for help. So then he's kind of, again, he's evaluating his resources, what he has. He's just barely any talking. He's just kind of going around the boat. He's working on how to resolve. And you just get this impression. This guy's capable. He knows what he's doing. He's strong. Then the storm rolls in. It's a really intense storm rolls in. And the boat is just getting thrown around, and he's trying to stabilize it. And at one point he goes out on the deck, and this wave comes and just poosh, and just throws him flying off the boat into the water, poof, underneath. And you're watching it, and you're like, wow. You just feel like, first of all, you feel like we are small. The most capable among us, small, weak. You think about the elements, the ocean. I mean, everywhere the cinematography is great. Everywhere the camera angle, you just see all there is in the horizon is just ocean. It's water. That's it. And he's this little tiny man, this little boat out there struggling to survive. At one point, I literally laughed out loud. To me, it was comic relief. He gets back down the cabin of the boat, and the waves hit, and he just goes bang into this pole, and he knocks himself out. And I just laughed out loud. It's like, yeah, I mean, how much worse can it get for this poor guy? He wakes up, is bleeding all over the place. Then he has to patch, he literally patches up his own gash in his own head. Well, then the hole there in the side, the water starts to fill, the boat's just filling up, and he has to abandon the sailboat. So he does, and he has this inflatable life raft. It's pretty good size, circular life raft, and so he throws it out onto the water and inflates it, and then tries to get some of his food and water and bring it off the boat. And he's having to wade through like several feet of water in the cabin of the boat to get these supplies, to throw them out onto the lifeboat, and he eventually gets out on that thing. And by now, I mean, you can tell he's just weakened. At this point, I think a couple days had gone by. He's starting to run out of water. I mean, he's weakening, breaking, despite all his capability. At one point, he's like in the fetal position. His eyes just closed, and you just see, I mean, he's just reduced to like a little baby almost. And he's floating there. Another funny scene, he's got this little makeshift fishing line thing. So he's going to fish. And I'm spoiling the whole movie. You don't have to see the movie now. This is it, all right? So he's fishing with this thing, and he gets a tug, and you can see like this sense, okay, he's going to have more food, right? Well, he starts to pull it in, and all of a sudden, just as it's coming in, the shark comes up and eats the fish. This poor guy. Can it get any worse for this guy? Nighttime comes, and or I don't know, maybe it was not nighttime, but this one, he sees this big cargo ship coming. So there's like a little glimmer of hope here. Gets out a flare. He's doing this thing. Cargo ship just goes right by him. Rummaging through his safety stuff and finds this flare gun thing. That night, another cargo ship sees this light. This cargo ship's coming. Takes the flare gun. Shoots these flares up. A couple of them. Nothing. You got to be kidding me. I wouldn't have made it like 10 minutes in those circumstances. Like as soon as the cabin fills, I'm like, God, just take me. But this guy he has made it. And he is hanging in there, man. Second ship just disappears. Finally, you can tell, he is just at the end of himself. Doesn't have any flares left. Sees off in the distance. It's dark, but sees this light way, way off in the distance. No flares left. He takes this real thick plastic type container and this paper that he had been using to journal some stuff, and he crinkles up the paper, throws it, cuts a hole in it, throws it in there, lights that on fire to create this little fire. It's, small little fire. And he's probably thinking, gosh, that's way out there. I don't know if that's... He knows, this is my last, this is it here. All is lost. So this is what he does. He literally lights the whole raft on fire and jumps in the water. And he's floating in the water. And this whole thing, he's just... And a few minutes go by, and he goes like this. Closes his eyes and just lets himself sink. And you see his body just going down. And it pans up, and you see on the surface of the water, you see that ring of fire of that lifeboat. And when you think, that's it. He's dead. And just then there's this flashlight from the surface of the water that goes, and you see his flashlight ray of light going through, and he just opens his eyes a bit, sees it, and then he swims up. And the very end of the movie is, totally ruining this movie for you. But you're getting it all in like 10 minutes right here. He reaches up, this arm reaches down and just pulls him out, and it ends. Hooray! Something good, thank God. You're welcome for the clinical depression you now have. a fantastic picture of your deliverance. Because everything I described to you earlier about the uniqueness of your depravity and how it wreaks havoc in your life, in your mind, in your relationships. If it were up to you, despite all your resources, your sense of internal fortitude and everything else, all is lost. But you have a delivering God who saves you. He saves you in a way you could never save yourself. And in one sense, when you think about why on earth do things have to go this way, for those of you who are in seasons of deep trial, why does it have to be this way? Why every direction I look, carnage, wreckage? Why does it have to be this way? The director of that movie, when interviewed, said, I wanted people to wrestle with their mortality. God is causing you to wrestle with your mortality, that you're small, that you need Him, that you can't save yourself. He's your Savior. He's that arm that reaches down when you think it's over and pulls you out. To where it was nothing of your own doing. Couldn't save yourself. He's our Savior. That's who our God is. And I can only imagine, the movie doesn't show it, but I can only imagine the relief, the celebration, the new sense of gratitude for life that man must have had. That's who our God is. He's the deliverer. Our life is about this storyline of rescue. I hope that's encouraging to you as you think about your need, your weakness, your inability, and His love for you, and His ability, and His strength, and His commitment to rescuing you, saving you. Let's pray. God, thank you for our time this morning to think together about the truth of who you are and the truth of who we are. You have filled this world with manifestations of yourself, illustrations, pointers of all kinds, even movies. Help us to accept our smallness, our need, the devastation of our sin, how it wreaks havoc in our lives, and also to celebrate this testimony of deliverance, what you have done, what you are doing, what you will do, because of who you are, because of your great love for us. God, we are in this moment very grateful. Help us as we float sometimes in the water, feeling like we're drowning. Help us to wait on you and your rescue. And if we're in a season in which we're sailing the high seas and having a grand old time, I pray you'd help us to remember that too is a gift. That too is a provision from you, from your hand. We thank you most of all for Jesus and what He did to come down and rescue us in ways we could never rescue ourselves. In Jesus' name, amen.